What is justice? When a system holds power over many lives? That is the question I want to begin with. Because that is no longer just a legal question. It is no longer only a political question. It is increasingly an algorithmic question. Today, systems help decide who gets seen and who disappears, who receives opportunity and who is denied it, who is flagged as risky, who is classified as valuable, who is recommended, ranked, filtered, approved, rejected, targeted, monitored, or ignored. And as these systems become more powerful, we are forced to ask a very old question in a very new setting. How should judgment be made? In Garden of Wisdom, I argue that one of the most important biblical figures for the age of AI is Abraham, not only because he is a patriarchal figure in religious history, but because he stands in one of Scripture's most astonishing scenes as a moral interlocutor. He does not simply accept power, he questions it. He enters into argument in the name of justice. He asks whether the innocent will be swept away with the guilty. He insists that judgment must not become morally crude. That is why Abraham matters now, because we are building systems of judgment. And the danger of such systems is not only that they may fail technically, it is that they may judge without wisdom. The scene I want us to focus on is the famous moment when Abraham pleads over Sodom. The city stands under judgment. Its corruption is grave. Its violence is real. Its moral disorder is not denied. And yet, Abraham does not respond by saying, "Then destroy it." He asks a more difficult question. What if there are righteous people within it? What if innocence is hidden inside corruption? What if a city cannot be judged as a single block? What if justice requires distinction? What if mercy is not weakness, but a higher form of intelligence? This is one of the great moments in moral literature, because Abraham refuses simplification. He does not deny evil, but he also does not allow power to flatten moral complexity. He does something remarkable. He argues for thresholds, for discernment, for the protection of the innocent, for the idea that even in a damaged system, not all lives are morally identical. That is exactly what our age needs to hear, because algorithms are always tempted by simplification. They reduce, they classify, they correlate, they detect patterns, they assign scores, they optimize decisions across populations, and all of that can be useful. But there is a danger hidden inside usefulness. The danger is that once a system becomes good at pattern recognition, we begin to trust it beyond its moral competence. We let it move from detecting regularities to shaping judgments, from assisting decisions to becoming the logic of decision making itself. And when that happens, one of the first things at risk is distinction. The system sees categories, but justice often lives in the exception. The system sees the aggregate, but dignity lives in the person. The system sees probabilities, but moral reality cannot always be reduced to probability. This is why Abraham becomes so important in Garden of Wisdom. He teaches us that true moral reasoning begins when we resist the seduction of totalizing judgment. He teaches us to ask, who is inside the category? Who is being swept up by the model? Who disappears when the system generalizes? Whose innocence is made statistically invisible? These are Abrahamic questions, and they are urgently relevant now, because much of modern governance is moving toward predictive logic. Predictive policing, predictive finance, predictive hiring, predictive medicine, predictive education, predictive security, predictive behavior analysis. All of these rely to one degree or another on algorithmic sorting. Again, the issue is not that such tools are always wrong. The issue is that they can become morally overconfident. They begin to assume that because they can detect risk, they know justice. Because they can identify a pattern, they understand the person. Because they can model a population, they can rightfully govern a soul. But Abraham teaches exactly the opposite. He teaches that justice requires moral hesitation, a pause, a challenge, a willingness to ask whether the logic of destruction, exclusion, punishment, or condemnation has gone too far. That is why I believe Abraham offers us one of the first great critiques of moral algorithms, not because he speaks in the language of code, but because he understands something deeper. Judgment must be answerable to conscience. Let us look more closely at what Abraham actually models. First, he models the refusal to confuse collective guilt with universal guilt. This matters enormously. Modern systems often operate at scale, and whenever scale enters judgment, there is a temptation to treat groups as if they were morally uniform. A neighborhood becomes dangerous. A demographic becomes high risk. A user segment becomes low trust. A social profile becomes suspicious. A region becomes unstable. But Abraham asks, are all within it the same? That is a profound ethical intervention, because justice begins where saneness ends. It begins where we insist that even within systems of corruption, innocence may remain. Even within statistical patterns, personhood remains. Even within damaged social realities, moral distinction must not disappear. Second, Abraham models moral audacity. He dares to question higher power. This is crucial for the AI age, because one of the most dangerous habits developing around powerful systems is passive deference. The model said it, the system flagged it, the platform detected it, the score predicted it, the machine recommended it. And too often, human beings begin treating system outputs as though they possessed final authority. But Abraham does not kneel before abstraction. He argues, he presses, he interrogates, he demands that justice be worthy of its name. That is one of the most important habits we must preserve. Human beings must remain morally capable of questioning the outputs of powerful systems, not because machines are always wrong, but because no system should be allowed to silence conscience. Third, Abraham models threshold ethics. Notice the structure of his plea. He asks, what if there are 50? What if there are 45? 40, 30, 20, 10? This is not random bargaining. It is a dramatic meditation on thresholds of mercy. How much goodness must remain before destruction becomes unjustifiable? How should the presence of innocence alter judgment? How should the possibility of righteousness change the logic of punishment? These are extraordinary questions for our moment, because algorithms often work through thresholds. A score above this number triggers concern. A profile below this threshold loses opportunity. A button crossing a line activates intervention. A classification label alters treatment. Thresholds are everywhere in modern systems. But Abraham reminds us that thresholds are never morally neutral. Where you place the line is an ethical act. How much uncertainty you tolerate is an ethical act. Whether mercy has room to enter the process is an ethical act. Whether the innocent can appeal the judgment is an ethical act. In other words, the architecture of decision making is itself moral, and if we forget that, we begin to treat design choices as though they were merely technical. They are not. they shape fate. This is why Garden of Wisdom insists that ethics cannot be added onto AI from the outside. Ethics must enter into the design logic itself, a system that does not know how to preserve distinction, that does not know how to remain open to appeal, that does not know how to account for hidden innocence, that does not know how to balance justice with mercy, is not yet wise enough to govern serious human realities. Now, let me say something even more challenging. Abraham does not only teach justice, he teaches intercession. He stands between judgment and the judged. That is morally profound. He is not personally identical with Sodom. He is not endorsing its corruption. He is not defending wrongdoing. He is doing something rarer. He is taking responsibility for moral pleading. He is saying, in effect, power must hear the case for life. That may be one of the most important lessons for our age. Because one of the greatest dangers of automated systems is the disappearance of the intercessor. When decisions are bureaucratized, digitized, and scaled, human beings can vanish into process. There is no one left to say, wait, look again, this case is different. This person is more than the file. This decision may be efficient, but is it just? Abraham stands for that human role. The role of the one who will not let judgment become impersonal. And that matters, because any civilization that loses the intercessor becomes colder, it becomes procedurally intelligent and morally brittle. It learns to process cases and forget persons. That is why, in the AI age, one of the great questions is not simply whether systems are accurate, it is whether there remains room for moral appeal. Can a decision be challenged? Can a label be contested? Can an innocence hidden by the model be seen? Can mercy interrupt the machinery? If not, then we are no longer building tools that assist justice. We are building systems that harden power, and Abraham warns us against exactly that. Now, some may object, do we really want mercy in algorithms? Do we not risk inconsistency, bias, emotional drift, and arbitrariness? It is a fair concern. But the answer is not to eliminate mercy. The answer is to understand that mercy is not the abandonment of justice. Mercy is justice made wise by the recognition of complexity. Mercy does not deny wrongdoing. It refuses moral laziness. It insists that judgment should not become blind to nuance, that punishment should not outrun understanding, that power should not become so confident in its categories that it forgets the mystery of the human being. That is why Abraham matters so much. He reminds us that the highest moral intelligence is not only the ability to identify wrongdoing, it is the ability to judge without losing sight of life. And perhaps this is where our current technological civilization is most at risk. We are becoming extraordinarily good at measurement, at detection, at tracking, at sorting, at ranking, at anticipating. But are we becoming equally good at protecting dignity? Are we becoming better at preserving the space in which the innocent are not crushed by systemic generalization? Are we building systems that understand moral irreducibility? Or are we quietly constructing a world in which everything becomes legible except the soul? In Garden of Wisdom, I return to biblical stories because they preserve moral memory against precisely this danger. They remind us that power without conscience is always tempted by simplification, that systems without humility drift toward domination, that justice without mercy becomes inhuman, and that no civilization should trust its own judgment if it has forgotten how to listen to an appeal from the vulnerable. This is what Abraham teaches us about moral algorithms. He teaches us that power must be questioned, that thresholds must be examined, that categories must be challenged, that the many must never erase the one, that innocence must not be statistically buried, and that true judgment remains answerable to a moral horizon beyond efficiency. Let me ask you directly, if an algorithm can predict risk, does that give it the right to define a person? If a system can sort populations, does that mean it understands justice? If a model can optimize public order, does that mean it knows how to protect the innocent? If a machine can identify patterns of harm, does that mean it has learned mercy? I would say no. Those are different capacities, and confusing them is one of the central moral errors of our time. So what would it mean to build Abrahamic algorithms? Not perfect algorithms, not sacred algorithms, but Abrahamic in spirit. It would mean systems designed with humility, systems open to challenge, systems that preserve appeal, systems that resist collapsing persons into probabilities, systems that acknowledge uncertainty, systems that recognize the ethical significance of thresholds, systems built to assist human judgment without replacing moral responsibility. Above all, it would mean remembering that justice is not merely a computational output. It is a relationship between truth, dignity, accountability, and care. That is much harder to build, but it is also much more worthy. Because the future of civilization will not depend only on whether our systems become more intelligent. It will depend on whether our intelligence remains answerable to the human and more than human lives affected by its judgments. Abraham understood that power must hear the plea for life. And if we forget that, then our algorithms may become efficient, but they will not become just as above, so below. In Garden of Wisdom, I argue that Abraham teaches us that any moral algorithm worthy of trust must preserve distinction, remain open to appeal, and keep justice answerable to mercy, conscience, and the dignity of life.